Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. So today I have my third part of my favorite and least favorite shade from each of my eyeshadow palettes. This is going to be the final part of this little series I've been doing, and I think this is going to end up being the longest part out of all three, but I'm definitely excited to wrap this video up and continue sharing my favorite and least favorite shades from my palette. Before we get into today's video, if you would consider subscribing, I would greatly appreciate it. I am so close to 500 subscribers. I would love to get there before the end of the year. So if you are interested, I would really appreciate it. I post a lot of eyeshadow content, tutorials, and different panning projects. So that's just a little bit of what to expect from my channel. So we can go ahead and jump into today's video. If you haven't seen the first two parts of this little series, I will go ahead and link those. But we have the final third, a little more than a third of my palettes today. So starting with Juvia's Place, the Nomad palette. This one is super pretty. My least favorite shade from here would be this yellow shade up here. It is a sequin matte shade, which is not my favorite formula, and it's just a little brighter than I would typically reach for. The shade next to it here is also a yellow tone shade, and I like that one a lot more. It's a little bit more muted, and I just like the quality of it better. For my favorite shade, I would have to go with this center one right here. It is just a very gorgeous everyday lid shade. I think it is absolutely stunning. I use it in almost every look that I create with this palette. It's a really, really beautiful shade, and I am always so happy to be reaching for that one when I reach into this palette. Next up we have my IBY Beauty Boho palette. This is another cute little 9-pan palette. So my least favorite shade from here would be Peace Out. I mentioned this in my previous video as well, but these darker purple shades of this sort of tone are not a favorite of mine, and I feel like this one isn't as smooth as some of the other shimmers are in this palette, so it's just not my absolute favorite formula, and it's just really not a favorite color of mine. I really like a lot of the shades in this palette. I feel like I have a little bit of a hard time choosing my favorite, but if I had to go with one, I think I'd go for Wild at Heart here, and this is simply because of the formula of this shade. It may not look like the most exciting, like you have these two blue-green shades, which are arguably more exciting colors, but Wild at Heart has such a beautiful, smooth formula to it, and I just absolutely adore that shade. I love how it performs. I like the color of it, so that one would probably be my favorite. Alright, next up we have my IBY Wonderland palette. This one has a lot of beautiful shades as well. My least favorite from this one would be the shade Gilded. Again, I mentioned this in my previous videos, but I am not a fan of yellow gold eyeshadows, and this one is definitely on the brighter side. I'm not a fan of this color. I don't know what it is, but it's not a favorite, and this bottom row of shimmers here is a little bit more on the chunky side compared to the ones that are up top. So they're just not a favorite of mine, so that one would definitely be my least favorite. As for my favorite, I am between a couple. I love reaching into these two shades here. I feel like I might go with the shade Whimsy as my favorite. It's just a really pretty, darker blue shade, but it is on the neutral side as well, so it is definitely a more wearable shade, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy when color can be incorporated into everyday, more neutral looks, and that one's just a really nice one to reach for. Adds a little pop to the look without being bright and in your face. Alright, next up we have Beautiful Shellz. So I have two of their Karma Chameleon quads. This first one here is the Iris Chameleon. I do have an affiliate link with Beautiful Shellz if you are interested. It is linked in my description box, and you can use my code JJBeauty to save 10%. I always just want to throw that out there if you are interested, but absolutely no pressure to use it. For my least favorite shade, I really like all of the shades in here, but if I had to choose one, I would probably go with the matte reddish shade here. Even though I do enjoy that shade, I've used it quite a bit in my looks, but I like the other shades in here just a little bit more, so this one is more a process of elimination rather than there's something wrong with the shade, but if I had to choose one, that is probably the way I would go. For my favorite shade, I would have to go with this one right here. All of their quads have a beautiful duochrome shade in here, and I really hope it's picking up on camera, but it has a really pretty blue to purple shift to it, and I just really enjoy this palette. I was not a big quad person before purchasing these palettes, and honestly I'm still really not, but I really enjoy this one and the other one I have from Beautiful Shellz. Alright, so the Peach Chameleon Quad has similar packaging, just a slightly different color, but the inside is a nice warm toned color story. So my least favorite shade from here would probably be this one. It's a really cool shift from orange to pink, but it's just a little brighter, a little more out there than I would typically be reaching for. So that is the reason I would consider this one my least favorite. It's just not one I'm going to be reaching for as much as the others, and it's just a little out of my comfort zone. If you've heard me talk about this palette, you can probably already guess what my favorite shade is, and it's going to be the same shade from the previous palette, this beautiful duochrome shade. I like this one more than the other palette, in fact. It just has such a beautiful shift to it, such an intense kind of icy blue shift, and I just think it's really pretty. It elevates a neutral look for sure, and I just think it's gorgeous. Alright, next up we have I Heart Revolution, and this is the brand that is going to cause this video to go a little bit long. So I have the entire Disney Princess collection that they came out with. There are 10 palettes within that collection, and then I have a couple others from them as well. So I will go ahead and go through the Princess palettes first. So this first one up here is Beauty and the Beast. So this one is a nice kind of more neutral color story, and I really enjoy this one. I think my least favorite shade from here, I didn't have one pre-picked, so I'm kind of choosing on the spot here because I do really like a lot of the shades in here, but looking at this palette just off the top of my head, I might have to go with Little Town. I just feel like that shade is a little bit out of place. I feel like the warmer toned kind of corally pink shade just doesn't make that much sense with the other shades that are in this palette. I have used it, but it's definitely one of my lesser used shades from this palette, so I think that one would probably go for my least favorite. As for my favorite, I am going to be very boring here, but I am going to go with the shade Cogsworth. I just think this one is such a beautiful everyday brown shimmer shade. I just really enjoy it. I think it has a little undertone of purple to it, which makes it a little bit more unique than just a typical brown shimmer. So I really enjoy that shade, and when I reach into this palette, I'm definitely reaching more for the neutrals, so it kind of just made sense for me to choose one of the neutrals as my favorite. Alright, next up we have the Tangled palette. So my least favorite shade from here would probably be 18 Years. It's just a bright pink shade, out of my comfort zone, and it's just not one I'm going to be reaching for a ton, especially over some of the shades in this palette. So that is why that one would be my least favorite. For my favorite, I would go with the shade Crown. I just think this is such a cute little light purple shimmer shade. I really enjoy it. None of these shimmers are super intense and in your face, but honestly, for everyday looks, I don't really mind that. I kind of like the more subtle aspect to them, and I just really love the color of that crown shade, so that one would be my fave. Alright, next up we have Sleeping Beauty. And I'm between a couple for my least favorite shade. I think I'm between Aurora and Make It Blue. Honestly, they're both a little bit out of my comfort zone, so it's a little difficult to choose between the two. I just feel like Aurora is a bit of a brighter pink, similar to what I was saying for the previous shade, and Make It Blue is just a brighter blue shade, so again, out of my comfort zone, so it would definitely be between those two for my least favorite, and I don't really know if I can choose. Moving on to my favorite, I'm also between two shades, and again, they're very different, so it's very hard to choose. I'm between Love and Diablo. Love is definitely more of an everyday wearable shade for me, but I just really love the color of Diablo. I think it's so pretty. It's like a smoky gray-blue color, and I think it's really pretty. So color-wise, I probably have to go with that one, but what I'm going to be reaching for to wear more often would definitely be Love. Alright, next up we have the Snow White palette. So my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Queen's Castle, I think. It's just kind of a satin brown shade, and I'm not a fan of that formula. I would rather it was purely matte or purely shimmer, but having just kind of a sheen to the shade just is not my favorite, and I feel like I don't really enjoy the color of it that much either. I feel like it's kind of a murky brown color, and it's just not a favorite of mine. For my favorite shade, I feel like this is a little bit more on the boring side once again, but I absolutely love the shade The Prince here. This is just such a nice pinky neutral brown matte shade. I really enjoy that type of shade for my crease, and that one would definitely be my favorite. It pairs so nicely with Diamonds and Rubies. Those together make such a nice, quick and easy look, and really love those. Alright, next up we have Princess and the Frog. We are halfway through my princess palettes. So my least favorite shade from here would be LaBeouf right here. I just don't really reach for that shade. It's a little bit on the brighter side compared to some of the other pinks in this palette, and I just am not really reaching for that shade, which is super funny because the two pink matte shades are some of my favorites in this palette, but I feel like those are a little bit more on the muted mauve tone side, whereas this one is just a little bit brighter, and it just makes it that much more out of my comfort zone, so that one would probably be my least favorite. My favorite would definitely go to Tiana. I love this entire top half right here, but Tiana is such a cute light green shade here. I think it's so pretty. I've used that one so many times, and every time I reach into it, I just absolutely love it. It adds that nice little pop of color without being too in your face and overwhelming. Alright, next up we have the Moana palette. And my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Montanui. It's, again, just that brighter blue color, out of my comfort zone. I feel like I'm saying kind of similar things for this, but I just kind of feel similarly about all of these shades that I am talking about, so it's out of my comfort zone. It's a little bit brighter, and I like the other shades in this palette more. For my favorite shade, I would definitely go with the shade Coconut. I love the color of this one. I feel like it's a unique color for me to choose, but I fell in love with that one when I first got this palette, and I continue to want to reach into that shade, gravitate towards it, so that one would definitely be my favorite. I just think it's such a fun color, and I really enjoyed using it. Alright, next up we have Aladdin. So my least favorite shade from here would be Magic Lamp. Going back to that yellow gold shade, just not a favorite. For my favorite shade, I would go with Agrabah here. This is just a really fun kind of purpley shade. It's a little bit on the brighter side, but I don't mind this one too much. It's not an everyday shade for me, but I really like the color of it. I think it's fun, and I do think the color is just so pretty. Alright, next up we have my Cinderella palette. There are a lot of pretty blue shades in here, but I would choose one of them for my least favorite. So that would go to Nightingale. I just don't really like that tone of blue very much. I think it's just a little bit brighter than I would typically reach for, and I am just really not a fan of just that sort of tone. But my favorite shade is also a blue shade, and that would be Miracles. I just think this one's a lot nicer, a lot more easy to use and wearable for me personally, and I just like the color of that one a lot more. I want to give an honorable mention to the shade Glass Slipper here because that's just such a pretty silvery color, and I think that one's super pretty as well. Alright, next up we have Mulan. So my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Flower, just that hot pink once again. I feel like I'm kind of running through these a little quickly, but I feel like I'm choosing kind of similar shades, especially for my least favorite throughout these palettes, so I don't really want to repeat myself too much, but that one, again, just out of my comfort zone, not a shade I'm reaching for a ton. For my favorite shade, I'm between two. I'm going to start with the shade that's in second place because I think it's really pretty and needs to be talked about, and that's Cricky right here. I just love that purple tone, but for my overall favorite, I would go with the shade Gong. Again, just a really beautiful silver shade, and I feel like it takes on a little bit of a purple tone, especially when paired with the purple shade, so I feel like that's kind of a little bit of a versatile shade, and I really enjoy it. Alright, the last of my princess palettes, this is The Little Mermaid, and my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Ocean. Again, the brighter blue shade. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but that one would be my least favorite. For my favorite shade, I feel like this is a little bit tougher. I feel like there are a few in here that I do really enjoy, like Alana and Aquata and Adela. I feel like are the ones I am debating between at the moment. I feel like if I had to just go with my gut right now, I might go Aquata. This one is just such a fun, lighter blue shimmer shade, but I feel like Adela also is so pretty, so it's definitely between those ones. I feel like there are a lot of fun, easy to use pops of color within this palette, and I really enjoy this one. Alright, moving on with I Heart Revolution, we have my Looney Tunes Tweety palette. I am such a big fan of Tweety, so I knew I had to pick this one up, and I think it's so cute. So my least favorite shade, if you can't guess, is Adventure. Just that yellow gold again. Not a fave. My favorite shade, though, would be Granny, which I know you're probably a little surprised that I would choose a pink shade that looks as bright as it does, but as you can see from the swatch, it's not super bright on the eyes. It's a little bit more on the powdery side. This is a little bit of a sequin matte, which is not my favorite formula, but I just really like the little pop of pink that this palette has, so I would definitely go for those as my favorite. Alright, next up we have Oh the Places You'll Go from the Dr. Seuss collab, and I love this palette. I just think it is one of the cutest palettes ever. I just really enjoy it. So my least favorite shade from here, you might think I'd go with this one, but I would probably choose this matte orange shade. I am not the biggest fan of these kind of true orange shades, especially when there are so many other fun colors within this palette. That one is just not a favorite of mine. For my favorite, I feel like you might also be surprised, but I would go with this shade right here. When I first got this palette, I did not think I was going to like that shade as much as I do, but when you put it on the eyes, it has such a beautiful, like, whitish, light pink reflect to it. I really hope you can pick that up on camera. It is not as dark and bright pink as it looks in the pan, It's such a gorgeous shade. So that one would definitely be my favorite from this palette. Alright, next up would be my Wet n Wild Stop Playing Safe palette, and my least favorite shade from here, funny enough, would be this green shade, the one shade I have pan on, and I think the reason this one is my least favorite is because of hitting pan on it. I had rolled this into a project probably a few years ago now, and I focused in on this one so much for so long, it felt like, and I honestly got a little sick of this shade, so I feel like that is why I would consider that one a least favorite. It's a pretty color, and under other circumstances I feel like I would really like it, but I feel like I just kind of burnt myself out on that one a little bit, so unfortunately that one would probably be my least favorite. As for my favorite, I am between a couple in this one. I really love the color of this bluish shimmer shade. I think it's super pretty, but I really love this little creamsicle orange shade. I really love this type of tone for oranges. I think it's super pretty, and it's a really nice tone of orange in my opinion, and it's one that I would definitely reach into, I gravitate towards, so that one would probably be my favorite from this palette. Next up we have the Wet n Wild Pac-Man collab. This is the Game Over palette. I love this palette. I'm a huge Pac-Man fan, and this one is so cute. If I had to choose a least favorite, I would probably go with this shade over here. It's just a brighter shimmer shade, not one I'm going to be reaching for a whole lot. And I've mentioned this in the past with this palette, but I love the little ghost imprints in some of these shades, and I just don't want to use those shades as much because I think they're so cute and I don't want to mess the ghost up. I did hit pan on one of them, but that was the nice white shimmer shade, but these other ones, I don't want to touch as much. I feel like they're just so cute as they are, but it's something I'm trying to get past. For my favorite shade, I would probably go with this matte bluish color over here, a nice kind of turquoisey color. I think it's super pretty. I've reached into that one quite a bit. As you can see, I do have pan on that shade, so that one is a nice favorite of mine. Next up we have my Maybelline Lemonade Craze palette, and my least favorite shade from here probably would be Ice Pop. This one's kind of by process of elimination as well. I feel like I like so many of the shades in this palette, and they're super easy to use, super wearable, so it just kind of came down to Ice Pop as my least favorite. It's a little bit on that brighter side, so it doesn't get used quite as much, but it is still a nice shade. It just, I like the other ones a little more. For my favorite shade, I would probably go with Strawberry Lemonade. This one is just such a pretty light pink shimmer shade. I really enjoy it. Nice and light, easy to use, so that one is just a top shade for me. Next up we have my NYX Flamingo Frost palette. This is such a fun little holiday palette. I am currently working on this in my Pan Those eyeshadows, and I'm so happy it got brought in for this time of year. For my least favorite shade, I feel like it's not going to surprise anybody, but it would probably be this shade over here, that bright hot pink matte shade. Just not a favorite, and the ones, I don't know if you can see the little kind of red corners to some of these shades, but those ones are technically not eye safe. I think they just mostly would have staining because I do use some of them, but it just kind of makes me not want to reach for that one as much, on top of it being such a bright hot pink shade, so that one would probably be my least favorite. For my favorite, I think I would have to go with this light kind of greeny shade here. I feel like it's not as pigmented as I would like it to be, but I really like the color, and I feel like it's a nice fun topper sort of shade, so this is a palette I kind of feel like I need to test out more, even though I did get it a year ago. I feel like I haven't reached for enough to truly come to a decision, but I do really like that shade, and there are a couple others in here I like a lot as well. Next up we have my NYX Ultimate Utopia palette, and my least favorite shade from here would be this kind of grungy green shade over here. It's just not an absolute favorite of mine. I feel like the formula of it is a little bit on the chunkier side. I'm not the biggest fan of the color. I love green eyeshadow, but that one just isn't an absolute favorite of mine. Speaking of green eyeshadow though, my favorite would be this lighter green over here. This one is definitely much more up my alley. That was a terrible little swatch of this one, but I like just that lighter green tone that one has, and I think it's super pretty, so that one would definitely be my favorite from this palette. Next up we have my Milani Soft and Sultry palette. So this one is just a nice everyday neutral palette. I bring this one with me traveling a lot if I'm traveling, so I really enjoy this one. My least favorite shade would probably be Tantation over here. I just feel like it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the colors in this palette. This is a predominantly cooler tone palette in my opinion, and having a more kind of pinky tone shade just doesn't really fit. I feel like it doesn't really go with the shimmers as well, and I'm much more likely to reach for the more cooler tone neutral shades, so that one would be my least favorite. My favorite would probably be Soft Touch, which seems like a very boring shade, but it is definitely a staple, especially when I reach into this palette. I just really love using that one as my initial transition shade. I reach into it, I think I can pretty confidently say, every time I reach into this palette, so I just really enjoy using that one, and it is just a really nice staple to have. Alright, next up we have my Tartelette Toasted palette, and this is such a nice warm tone palette. Kind of the exact opposite of the previous palette we just had, but my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Crackle. It is a very intense sequin matte shade. I feel like you can see the glitter really pressed into this one, and I am just not going to reach for that shade, especially over Fireside, which is, again, a dark brown, but this one is just pure matte. So I'm definitely going to reach for that one over this one, and I feel like I would use them similarly, so Crackle just does not get a lot of use from me, and I definitely could have done with something different in its place, but it's fine. My favorite shade from here would be the shade Cashmere. I mentioned a little earlier about these creamsicle orange shades. I just really enjoy them. This is the only shade in this palette that has pan. It is the tiniest little baby pan, but it is there, and I just really enjoy that shade. I just really like the color of those kind of creamsicle oranges. Alright, next up we have my Huda Beauty Nude Light palette, and this is a really nice kind of everyday palette for me, and I feel like there aren't really any shades in here that I truly dislike, but if I had to choose a least favorite, I would probably go with this pink shimmer over here. It's definitely my least favorite out of the shimmers, and it's just not one I'm reaching for a ton within this palette, so I feel like I would have to say that one is my least favorite. For my favorite, I am debating between the two I have pan on. I feel like I would go with this one. I just really enjoy this lighter pink shimmer. I feel like it has a little shift of gold, kind of orangey to it as well, so it's not just a pure pink, and I think that's super fun, but it is subtle enough to where I can use this for everyday looks, and I really enjoy it. Alright, next up from Huda Beauty we have the Desert Dusk palette, and right off the bat I can tell you my least favorite shade is Cosmo. It is a pressed glitter, and I just really do not like those shades, but if we are excluding pressed glitters from this little ranking, I would choose Blazing as my least favorite. Again, just kind of that brighter orange, true matte orangey shade. It's just not a favorite of mine. But for my favorite shade, kind of an orangey tone as well, but the shade Eden up here is just a lot more wearable for me. I think it's super cute. It kind of has a little bit of a corally undertone to it as well, so it's not like a pure orange shade, and I just really enjoy that one. I think it's so pretty, and it pairs really nicely with a lot of the shades in this palette. Alright, moving on to our last brand for this video. I am on to ColourPop. This is their Sweet as Can Be palette, and my least favorite shade from here, this is a tough one for sure. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have definitely said the shade Sing Ho, and I might still go with the shade based on process of elimination, but I had rolled that one into, I think it was Pando's eyeshadows, so I was reaching for a lot more, and I actually really enjoyed that shade a lot more than I thought I did, so it's not a bad shade by any means. I actually did enjoy it, but I still don't know if I like it as much as some of the other shades in here, but it's by no means a bad shade. For my favorite, I am between two, and it's Oh Bother and Rumbly. I really love these kind of mauve-y toned matte shades. This is a sequin matte, so it's not my absolute favorite. So for that reason alone, I think I might go with Oh Bother. This is just a cute little light pink shimmer. I feel like I've chosen a lot of light pink shimmers for my favorite shades in my palettes, but I just think they're so easy to use. They're so pretty, and I just really enjoy them. So I feel like that would be my choice for this palette. Alright, next up we have the main Squeeze palette from ColourPop. So my least favorite shade from here would be the shade Home Slice. I feel like this one is a little bit of a satiny shade, and it's a little bit on the brighter side, so it's out of my comfort zone a bit. For my favorite shade, I would go with Maraschino right in the center here. I just think this one is such a pretty little shade. This is obviously a monochromatic red shade. I feel like I didn't really have a ton of choice when it came to the color of the shade, but I just really enjoy that one. I think it's a pretty color, and I've enjoyed using it the handful of times I have reached for it. Alright, next up we have Baby Got Peach. So my least favorite shade would most likely be the glitter once again, but ignoring that shade, I would probably go with this one, I think. I'm kind of between this one and Centerfold, but again, I'm just not the biggest fan of those true matte oranges, so I might have to go with that one. It's not by any means a bad shade, and I don't really dislike it that much, quite honestly, but I just like the other shades in here a little bit more. For my favorite shade, I would probably go with Get Even. I just think this is such a pretty peachy shimmer shade. I feel like a lot of the shimmers in here look kind of similar, but they all kind of have slightly different shifts to them, and I just really enjoy that one. I think it's easy to use, and it's really pretty. Alright, next up we have Wild Child. This one is definitely hard to choose a least favorite from because there are just a lot of nice neutrals in this palette. I think maybe if I had to choose one, I might go with Close Up. It's just kind of a mid-tone brown shimmer shade, not an absolute favorite, so I might choose that one. But again, there are a lot of nice staple shades in this palette. It's kind of hard to choose. For my favorite, I'm between a couple. I really like the shade Fierce, but it's a little bit on the chunkier side compared to what I like for a shimmer. I also really love the color of this Grassland shade, but I'm not the biggest fan of the sequined formula, but I might go with that one just because I do like the color of that one a little bit more. Alright, next up is my favorite palette in my entire collection. This is the ColourPop It's a Princess Thing palette. There are so many good colors in here. My least favorite would be One Kiss. Again, just that yellow gold, kind of a classic least favorite for me. My favorite shade would be Thingamabob, I think. I just adore this shade. I barely touched into this, and it's just so pigmented, so foily, metallic-y looking, but it's still a smooth, fine shimmer formula, so I really enjoy that one. But There are a lot of shades in this palette that I absolutely adore. Again, this is my favorite palette, so of course I love a lot of these shades, but I think Thingamabob would still take the cake for me. Alright, next up we have Midnight Masquerade, another one of their Disney princess collabs. So again, ignoring the glitters in this palette, I would go with Mrs. Potts as my least favorite. Again, just that classic antique yellow gold shade. Not a fave. For my favorite shade, I would probably go with the shade Mama Odie over here. It's beautiful. It's a pink to green shifting shade. I have gotten so many compliments when I wear this shade, and I just think it's absolutely stunning. I love the shift in it, and yeah, it's so pretty. Alright, our final palette up is the ColourPop Back to Hogwarts palette, and I am not going to be very original for my least favorite shade here with these last palettes, but it would probably go to Golden Snitch. Again, I'm not going to repeat myself a bunch, but that yellow gold, not a favorite, so that one would be my least favorite. As for my favorite shade, there are quite a few in here that I really love. I feel like one that surprised me with how much I'm drawn to it is the shade Butterbeer, with it being kind of a brighter orangey shimmer shade. That is not a shade I would typically find as one of my favorites, but I do really enjoy it. But if I had to choose my absolute favorite, I think I would probably go Gillyweed. Again, I just love a light green shimmer shade like that. I've chosen a few within this video as my favorite, and I would probably continue that with this palette. I just really love that tone, and I think it's so pretty. Alright, so that does conclude today's video, the final part of sharing my favorite and least favorite shades from each of my palettes. This was so much fun to just kind of go through my palettes in my collection and figure out what I like, what I maybe dislike, and yeah, I just had a lot of fun looking through them, so I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you guys thought of this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future uploads. And with all of that said, I will see you in my next video. Bye!